One of the topics that I sort of reached out to you a couple months ago with some interest in, I was just having a look at it before, and one of them is something in the mix of the relationship between philosophy, the elite, and the demos. We could mean a number of things by just, the elite with quotation marks. And I think that is a curious thing in this case. I mean, you're someone who I know to have a tremendous interest, obviously, in the work of Whitehead, Schelling, amongst a number of others. And I share as well a profound interest in Whitehead as being tremendously influential on my philosophical thinking, and perhaps more deeper, the stream of understanding I can participate in, which I might not always have or have had really exquisite conscious movement or awareness of, and yet nevertheless it's been influential in a deep sort of sense. I've been swimming this way or that way in the context of that current, and so the degree to which I'm aware of how influenced I am is somewhat in precision up for question, and yet there's a deep sense that I've shared many interests in common with you over some time, and that's a basis for philosophical reflection. And in the case of Whitehead and others, it enables an awesome way of relating to from my perspective, both the intimacies and immanences of experience as well as the cosmic picture. And so in that sense, the degree to which we can play together with that language and understand together with that language, it's wide-ranging and powerful. And so that's kind of there. And then I mentioned philosophy, the elite, and the demos. I know another interest of yours, often I hear you remarking on various current events in the world, sometimes some political issues. And I'm curious about, it's too much to say just the relation between the two, but certainly I've lived a life and very much attempted to pursue philosophy in the context of embodied process in the world. It's been influential in how I've tried to build things, of how I've tried to relate to the currents of our time, of how I've lived and my orientation for living. And so it's somewhere in that mix of the deep metaphysical right through to the, in a sense, the kind of fractured chaos and sometimes wild absurdities of living in the context of present cultural life, that I'm joining you here today in conversation. I have interests in that gap in some critical sense, to be really with the depth of it, but also to have the depth of that ground in some sense in the context of our time, in the context of communication in our time, in the context of real exchange. And so I'm curious, maybe feel free to reflect on any of this at all and take it any way you like, but as an opener with respect to that, I'd be very interested for you to share with our listeners today and myself some of the themes of your recent work, some of the themes of your interest as it's cultivated over time, and perhaps anything about yourself you'd like to share in relation to all of that.
I admit to feeling a bit of embarrassment whenever I share something online of of the political variety, and that's because I can feel the ways in which ideology is alive in myself, various ideologies vying for my attention, my allegiance. And I'm quite sensitive to the ways in which we are all, myself included, vulnerable to capture by these ideologies. And it's very difficult to even begin to articulate oneself for or against, or in some vast no man's land in between, in response to whatever the political issues of the day are. And so I guess my embarrassment comes from my worry and my sense of vigilance about the extent to which I might be captured by one or another ideological framework. Philosophy is an attempt to free ourselves from ideology. I would say is one way of characterizing it. And one of the tests that I use to gauge the extent to which I'm not falling into an ideological trap is that I'm upsetting people across the various spectrums of political ideology. To the extent that I do that, I feel like I'm not falling into a pre-established groove, right? Philosophy is traditionally something practiced by elites. It's not that one needs to have an expensive education to be a philosopher. Sometimes too much education can actually inhibit philosophical insight, can inhibit wisdom. Knowledge is not the same as wisdom, right? So it's not elitism in the sense that one needs to have a fancy degree in order to practice philosophy. One does need a basic, sense of literacy and, all of that stuff. But when we go back to ancient Greece, which is, this post on X that you're referring to, where I was struggling with the ways in which Plato, in his vision of what an ideal society would look like, and we can question whether his dialogue Republic is really a literal plan for an ideal society or a kind of inquiry into the nature of the soul, which I think it's more that than it is a literal plan. But regardless, we might still study that dialogue to learn about how he thought the ideal society might function. And in that context, he has Socrates reflect on the vulnerability of democracy to tyranny. Socrates says something like, democracies tend to be something like a drunken pleasure cruise, where the ship of state is aimless because leaders just cycle through based on who is able to drum up, by appealing to emotions, typically in passions, the most support from the majority of the people. And so rather than a society being led by the wise, a society is led by by the lowest common denominator, by desire, by the passions, by fickle emotions. And in contemporary American politics, it's quite clear that democracy can easily be hijacked, and the demos, the people, are not necessarily always capable of voting in their own best interests. Now, my struggle is as a Platonist, more or less. I as a philosopher, can't help but inherit Plato's way of thinking. I don't know that Plato has doctrines that he is espousing. He wrote dialogues, right? He doesn't have doctrines, though Platonism often gets characterized as a set of doctrines. It's the way of philosophizing, the way of asking questions that Plato engaged in that I inherit, and that's why I would call myself a Platonist. But I also am committed to these more or less liberal ideals of individual freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, democracy, in other words. And, Whitehead makes this comment in his book, Adventures of Ideas, that, in our modern context, rather than having a society stratified into these classes, with philosopher kings ruling. Everyone in a democracy would be entitled to that sort of paideia, that sort of enculturation or Bildung, so as to become more or less philosophical in their outlook on life. And so rather than, this class stratification, we have a society wherein everyone orients towards life as a pursuit of deeper understanding, learning as a collective process, and democratic self-governance naturally flows from that commitment to wisdom, to truth, beauty, goodness, and so on. We're very far from that. But as an educator, a teacher, and someone who is lucky enough to get to play for a living, and has a job or a way of earning a living or a form of work that's actually provides me a great deal of leisure, I feel quite driven to, draw as many people as I can into this lifelong process of learning. I think a healthy democratic society would be one wherein everybody is involved in a lifelong process of learning. And we don't think of school as something you go to as a kid, or maybe for a degree to get a job or something. No, it's just what we do as human beings. We learn from birth to death. And death itself is also a learning process. Dying, at least, is a learning process. And then there's Aristotle, who in his Politics says that there would not, in his ancient context, in Athenian and Greek civilization, without slavery, he says, there just wouldn't be time for me and other elites to engage in philosophy. There wouldn't be the leisure time required if Aristotle had to do his laundry and grow his food and tend to the household chores and whatnot. And then Aristotle adds that it's a kind of irksome burden that that slave owners have to treat their slaves well enough that they won't revolt, but not so well that they'll become lazy. These are the sorts of comments, and it's just a totally different civilizational context. I don't bring that up to try to cancel Aristotle. I think slavery was an institution taken for granted by every civilization on every continent for the entirety of human history until a few hundred years ago. And it's important to keep that in context when we think about democracy. Democracy was born in a time and place when slavery was taken for granted. And we no longer take it for granted. We find it, most of us, abhorrent. But what changed? Did our morals change, or did industrialization create a way for us to get those basic needs met with less manpower, right? Or a bit of both. Aristotle, or one final thing I'll add is, in Plato's Republic, he doesn't mention slaves. So some scholars have said, well, that's because he didn't feel like he even needed to mention. It was so obvious that, of course, there would be slaves. Why even bother to mention it? Others say, well, he didn't mention it because in his ideal society, he knew it was unjust ultimately, and so he didn't include slaves. I don't know which way to go on that question, but I find myself asking it frequently. And in the age of the rise of AI, new sorts of challenges become apparent as ever more of our daily lives become automated. What's left for us to do as human beings in that context? So those are some reflections. I mean, I think about these political questions, these social questions quite a lot. I think metaphysics is not incidental to these sorts of questions, but you have to make those connections explicit because not everyone is weird enough to care about metaphysics.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that's so curious to me and so critical for both philosophy as well as, at least in some phase of it, any social process that requires or has space for reflection about what's actually happening and maybe what we should do. I hesitate to say something like that is the domain of politics because, politics is colored by so many things. It seems like in our time, politics has become something that has so contorted and adapted into subterfuge and conflict and causation and, truth, justice. It feels like to be remotely, sort of naively idealistic that such things are really all that present in the relational context of politics really does seem too naive. Maybe I'm being perhaps a little bit too critical. It just seems that game has become quite something, and of course has been developing that way for a long time. And so I have been really interested in the question of what is it to do philosophy? What is it to do philosophy together? What is it to communicate? What is it to help each other see? What is it to understand? All of this. Of course, a lot of that requires self-knowledge and self-work, and there are many voices within and all of that. And I'm not trivializing that for a second. It's absolutely essential and very, very interesting. But I am curious about how it is that it is so difficult, so challenging in social contexts, let's say for reflection and understanding, to actually be able to presence. And slavery is an incredible example, as you say, for millennia, across cultures, ubiquitous, critical to the economic functioning, critical to the belief structures of how the world works, how it needs to work in order for us to do any kind of reflecting at all, in order for us to do any of the philosophy thing in this case. And yet, right there, in a naive sense, we could say, and I imagine every young person growing up most young people growing up and learning about slavery for the first time, initial reaction is, oh, these people, how could they? How could it be like that? It seems so difficult to really embody and in that deep sense of participation, understand that context for discernment, that context for functioning. And I bring this up in part just to emphasize, in a critical sense, the nature of though I'm not trying to do that too immediately for you and I here and now, but in principle, there's an immediacy of our shared relational field that exhibits something like the same phenomenon in some critical sense as human beings, as, well, let's just go with human beings. We're here open to, there's a better way to say this, open to suffer from that same bias. We're open to these same processes of delusion, security, these biases of security, this necessity of taking for granted that set of ordered relations across multiple levels that make possible our holding together enough in place so as to relate with some boundary that we're sharing that is interesting, in which we can weave with some novelty and remain in some kind of continuity of coherence. In some critical sense, we are beholden to the history of order to some critical degree for us to relate with novelty, for us to orient with potential. And that strikes me as an interesting place in which, Whiteheadian language can actually serve very well in offering some, let's say, metaphysical architecture for reckoning with that kind of process, or reckoning with that reality. We are, in some critical sense, like living historical creatures, and yet at the same time we participate in creativity, but that creativity is not in some important sense totally unbounded from itself, from its living history, from the artifact of it. And so, yes, and this though does speak in some important sense to the promise of philosophy, not as an abstract activity, of course, engaging with abstraction, but the promise of it has often been for me that through philosophy it's possible to illuminate with a profound richness actually our living context of belonging together here, of our relationality, of the possibility for communication and creation and coherence and all of these things at all. So that's what comes to mind in terms of my own way of finding some handholds in this challenge of relating, on the one hand, philosophy to some of the most challenging aspects of civilizational communication in our times, social relating in our times, what it is for some kinds of animals to relate to each other. Hey?
Yeah, I mean, philosophy is friendship with wisdom, right? And I don't know that that's just me trying to be friends with this being. I think of her as a being, Sophia, but it's also the context within which philosophy happens, as I was saying, is dialogue, right? And Whitehead says at one point, again in his book Adventures of Ideas, that the pure conservative is fighting against the essence of the universe. But on the other hand, he says any civilization that ignores the importance of routines and habits that are inherited from the past is going to destroy itself. Because, he says elsewhere, I think it's his book, Introduction to Mathematics, he says that civilization advances by increasing the number of important tasks that it can accomplish without thinking about it. And so at this advanced stage of civilization, our societies are extremely complicated. And we're not always conscious, we're usually not conscious of all of the subtle processes, feedback loops that maintain the order of our societies. And sometimes, as we have seen historically, when revolutions occur, there's this rush with the best of intentions to make society function more rationally, to progress beyond some of these entrenched power structures and so on. But as was evident, in the Reign of Terror that followed the French Revolution, this effort to totally start fresh, start as though one could, begin year zero and start human civilization over from scratch on rational principles alone. It's quite naive, dangerous. We are historical creatures. To the extent that we can exercise freedom, it's by through careful recollection of history, because history is the material we have to work with in the exercise of freedom in the present. And so, this tension between habit and novelty, between, if you want, conservation and progression, is right at the core of Whitehead's metaphysics, but also his sociology and his understanding of how human civilization, it can, and he'd make the normative claim, should attempt to balance balance itself, as much as possible on that knife edge between what we inherit and what we are in pursuit of. And he, as a English-speaking man living in the 20th century, was very big on freedom as an ideal, and his whole view of the history of humanity is tracing the gradual ingression of the ideal of freedom. And it's taken thousands of years for that ideal to even begin to manifest in terms of our institutional structures and legal structures and economic structures. And we're hardly finished. There's still a major gap between how most of us imagine the ideal of what a free society would be like and where we are. But it's so important, and this is a perspective that's only come to me as I've aged a little bit. It's so important to recognize that, and I'm not going as far as like Steven Pinker on this or something, but things could be much, much worse, and were much, much worse than they are today. Slavery being one example. And just the rapidity of change over the last few centuries, with an exponential increase going back just the last few decades, the last 5 years, hell, it makes it easier for us to forget how much has been accomplished in terms of the realization of these ideals. And so we don't want to unintentionally saw the limbs off that we're perched upon in an effort to bring about change even faster, a kind of progressive change even faster, because I don't think our civilization has enough redundancies built in. I think it's actually quite fragile. And all of the technology that we now have actually makes it more fragile, because we've lost all the skills that would be required to sustain human life if the power goes out. Right? So it's a precarious situation. But I do think it's important to take stock, and recognize what has been accomplished.
Yes, I think that's fair. Absolutely. Hi, it does amp up the tensions though, because working with that perspective, I think it can be seen that in any system, whether we're speaking about an individual psyche or a group, country, the context of social order, it can be destabilized. And the question becomes, in this room, among this group of people, given this activity, how much of the game, whether of personas in relation, of whatever titrated, tightened voice, whatever that momentary, fragile quasi-unity is, well, maybe it needs to remain for some time. Maybe too much truth in that context would blow it apart. And what would that be in service of? Now, who would have ears to hear it? Presumably, and in my experience, there are absolutely defense mechanisms in the psyche to dissociate, to not listen, for the bouncers outside the room, or however else metaphorically we want to speak about it, to prevent that voice from speaking. And so it's worthwhile recognizing that as a sort of essentially kind of like table stakes for what it is to relate with others. And yet, what is it to be open to possibility, in some sense, to speak for or with or in service of that truth, which might, again, to use a too coarse metaphor, but if we're speaking about the movement from slavery to not slavery, then in some critical sense there's a threshold of recognition that we shouldn't do this. Now, it's kind of interesting. It's hard to imagine. I have to take a moment to reflect. We've all had those moments of recognizing our being or our referring to ourselves as being wrong. But even here, wrongness is something which is difficult to bring in this case, into absolute clarity unless we are truly sharing that same context of understanding, unless we've built that context of understanding into our communication. I can imagine many arguments, different perceptions being brought into the fore that move the needle somewhat more slowly from slavery to not slavery into the minds and conceptions of people of the time. We often find ways to change our behavior that might acknowledge some partial aspect of the case, but might not fully take on board the full hit of it. Maybe it's too much. It's too much to have to hold a continuity of psyche in the context of tremendous change and perhaps feelings of culpability, how to even relate to that in a healthy way. A deep philosophy of healing and integration, and these things sort of take time. And so kind of the context that I'm wanting to speak to and kind of animate here, or at least what I'm feeling as super interesting, and is just by way of sharing a little bit of what my work has been over these years. And given we share a number of influences, and given we've both felt called to a philosophical path, there's been so many different concrete scenes to it. It's taken that, we live in different countries. I'm not part of academia. The room, in some sense, for me to speak philosophy in and with others in hasn't existed. In my experience, it did not exist tremendously healthily in the context of the universities I was a part of. When I learned of California Institute of Integral Studies, I thought, that seems like somewhere where there might in fact be a little bit more richness of discourse that's possible. And that's, for those of listening who don't know yourself, that's where you teach at. And so the prospect of cultivating the kind of context for communication where philosophy is possible is a tremendous challenge in our time. It's been a challenge I've been seeking to be with and respond to. And it really does bring in so much. There's no philosophy without healing. There can't be. There's no philosophy without awareness of what it is to participate in transformation, and therefore what it is to relate with chaos, what it is to relate with the void, what it is to relate with progressively more and more of the constraints that were once thought of as fixed, that maybe aren't, or that maybe need to be. In some cases they might need to be, but maybe you don't understand why, and it's hard to communicate why. And yet there they are. So do we talk about that one then? Or maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe that's exactly what we should talk about. But actually my particular place in some context of power that I believe is necessary to hold together X and Y, how do we relate with that? And so, at the core of my work really has been something profoundly radical. And it's one of the things that's made life sometimes tremendously rewarding, but also very, very challenging. Because there's often been this sense, I suspect, when I'm speaking with people who are, let's say, further away from the relational context that I've had time to contribute build in reciprocity with those people. So there's more unknowns, let's say, that the potential for turning left when it would seem for all the world that just straight ahead through business as usual would be what would be appropriate there. But turning left, or some little resonance of question, of challenge, of not knowing, right? Presencing uncertainty. I know you speak about improvisation and dialogue and what have you. This is fundamentally core to the whole project of voicecraft in some very rich ways. But the very process of that is one which is in some radical sense often in a profound destabilizing antagonism with rigidity and social process as usual. And so it's been an interesting journey and many wonderful moments and real successes, and also so many open questions and just the whole world to go on the journey of understanding what supports philosophy together now. What is it really to do philosophy together? How many can hold together in that process? What are the various membranes that might be necessary? And here we're speaking about philosophy, and it's good to bring up the reflections of, love and friendship and these things. It's far from arcane and ivory tower. In some sense, it's the very essence of our being together here at all, in communication, in friendship. And so, yeah, I'm with a tremendous amount of possibility here in this kind of expression. I find it tremendously inspiring, and so it's nice to share it with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think of you know, back to this term leisure and what school really is. School, scola in Latin, is leisure, and so what does it take to have the context wherein philosophy becomes possible? It takes leisure time, which schools, universities, I think originally were intended to be a place sort of set outside of the hustle and bustle of doing business, of statecraft, of politics and the economy, where we can just devote ourselves to quiet contemplation and conversation, dialogue about a deeper levels, layers of reality that we're always presupposing when we're engaged in business transactions and political affairs, but which, because we're acting in those realms, we don't always have the time to reflect, right? And so philosophy is about stepping out of the flow of daily affairs on some level to reflect upon it, which isn't to say that contemplative practice is not itself a form of activity. It's just not physical activity. It's metaphysical activity, if you want. But the problem has become nowadays, universities, like so many of our institutions, are self-perpetuating, self-justifying, and the world around them. Our institutions are thousands of years old in their original founding and purpose, most of them, and they haven't adjusted themselves to a dramatically new set of circumstances. And in universities and academia, we still have these disciplinary boundaries where it's almost like the ancient guilds, where there's a lot of protectionism going on and a lot of the advances in knowledge, which might otherwise be possible, are inhibited because of a refusal to cross disciplinary lines. You risk tenure. You risk being accused of betraying, your guild by collaborating with these other people who have a different set of abstractions. That's not the set of abstractions that all these people over here have built their careers around. And so there's a lot of that going on in academia. But despite that, I still really value the role that universities can play in our society. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but here in the US, the university system from the Ivies on down is under attack for some good reasons. But as is so often the case, when the demos gets excited, the baby goes out with the bathwater. Hierarchy is a very charged term nowadays. It exists in academia, right? We have these titles, um, assistant, associate, full professor, et cetera, adjuncts versus core faculty, and just professor versus student for a basic sense of hierarchy. And in so many other areas in life, these kinds of hierarchies are, on the one hand, we take them for granted, but on the other hand, there are, as in the case of free people and enslaved people in the ancient world, there are ways in which, while we may have almost eradicated that particular form of social hierarchy, there are other forms of entrenched hierarchy that we inherit from our history as a species, that we might want to challenge and change. And but there can be a kind of righteous fervor in the effort to undermine any hierarchy that actually is self-defeating. And so again, it's this trying to hold this tension. We're really in desperate need of wisdom. Very few leaders in our political system have that. Where is it? Where are the people with wisdom? That's a good question. In terms of the role of philosophy in all of this, while again, I work in a university, I value universities. Many universities are closing their philosophy departments or defunding them because they have no immediate payoff in terms of prestige for the university, funding for the university. They're not directly training students to enter the workforce in many cases. And, to be honest, a lot of the kind of philosophy that's taught in the English-speaking world is not only not relevant to, securing a job, but not relevant to human life generally. It's just solving puzzles and inventing linguistic problems and building, again, it's a self-perpetuating institution that's building careers around certain jargons that aren't really serving anyone outside of the context of that guild. But what I have been encouraged by in the last decade plus is how much the online spaces are beginning to pick up the slack and become more philosophical, and in a way that's far less elitist and with a far lower financial commitment, in order to participate, to be a part of those spaces. And a lot of these spaces are virtual. Sometimes it's a mix of virtual, and people go on retreats together, and all these schools, these communities, these groups are popping up full of autodidacts and people who are just innately curious and hungry for understanding and camaraderie in the pursuit of that understanding. They don't care about degrees. They're drawn to teachers who display the skill and the virtue that naturally attracts the students. And so it's not just, oh, this person has a degree title, and so I will go receive a credential from them. And that's a very positive thing. And I love to see that. And it could be that actually philosophy can thrive more in that kind of a distributed context outside of academia, outside of universities, because the universities are becoming increasingly hostile to it, and not the sorts of environments that would be conducive to friendship with wisdom.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think it can, and just to say as well, I mean, I think it is, but just to say that I often speak about academia and politics and whatever the institutional context with can speak about it shorthand in a way that is inaccurate with respect to the whole of the effort that actually makes up and the people that actually make up those contexts. It's actually one of those things about which, if we were speaking privately, it would almost be easier to communicate more quickly. There is often a tension I've felt that, I have tremendous appreciation for the spirit of universities, the spirit that in principle can animate universities, and I'm sure does. I'm presently not part of any. Always difficult to speak from a distance about such things as spirit, Much easier to feel when it comes to vitality. Certainly there are many people I respect inside the context of the university who have been influenced by universities, all of that. The point regarding baby out with the bathwater is very much well taken. And, to speak of the US context, it's both from inside and outside that the universities are assaulted, let's say. That is not an easy thing to pull apart, and maybe not something we can speak to too much in this conversation. I think maybe there's so many interesting things to speak to. And yet, nevertheless, I feel there is presently no other way forward with respect to building, growing, nurturing the philosophical context of tomorrow, let's say, which do definitely exist in pockets today already and can always be realized. But it is slowly. It's slowly because so many of the economic questions, the questions of power, the various, to incorporate the value of hierarchy in the new era of philosophy will be interesting. It's not necessarily clear. I agree with you that the financial access is, prohibitive in the for many people in the context of current universities, and that it's less so presently, but also that most people attracted to non-institutionally affiliated learning, or at least a higher proportion of those people, are people who are, maybe they've already metabolized or are just otherwise different, but than needing that credential, to justify the time and energy and effort. And I totally understand the drive toward credential in the context of seeking job and employment. Places don't have health insurance, all these types of things. Not all countries have social safety nets. There's families, there's tremendous pressure people face. It doesn't make it any, there are some people who are more ready, willing, and able to participate in the creation of these contexts of tomorrow. I think there is more of a burden and sacrifice that some people are capable of making, is their path to make. But it is an interesting one because so much, even, it's about knowledge and wisdom, we do, speak to each other today in a context where justification, trust in justification, trust in authority, it's a trivial thing to say. It's tremendously damaged, and it's not a trivial problem whatsoever, because we do need to trust teachers, and so I appreciate it's very difficult for people seeking to fund, in some sense at the moment, if we can bring in some other notions, it seems to me that philosophy as something associable to the lifeblood of the relating commons, something like this, that to the degree it's not appreciated or recognized as critical to the commons. Of course, we live in a time where the commons as such is difficult to appreciate en masse or to remain in coherence with for many, many reasons. At the moment, if one is seeking to open the possibility for philosophy, to kindle that where possible, to kindle that possibility for transformative communication and real decent treatment of each other and friendship and all of that, relying on the crucible of market process alone seems to be lacking. Not that it's not relevant in some important sense, not that it's not an important check. It's certainly something to contend with, but also in the context of regulating states, or that justification context that is that regulatory authority, that proxy. Well, in some sense, we're speaking about that which is sort of ill-equipped. And I do tend to notice that the majority of the money, the resources that can otherwise support the commons, do tend to proxy themselves very strongly to whether market process, and again, these all have to be reckoned with. I'm not trying to be too basic about this, but they proxy very strongly to market process. They proxy over strongly to the rigidity of, let's just call it, it's not just state authority, we're going to call it present cultural norms, the present societal attitude with respect to what is trustworthy and what is not. And so this slowly thing, it really is building, for me, it's about building in really showing up in integrity to the relational process of sharing, understanding together, in helping each other to see, and really not to take too many steps ahead of that process, basically. Have that always be held as sacred. And through that, to infuse the many other types of social process and action that need to be taken, much of which is only relevant to talk about depending on the membrane of shared interaction. And part of the reason why I'm interested in these podcasts and trying to find language that can speak both publicly and privately and give hints toward the possibility for building that context, which it's not possible necessarily to speak in just yet, but might become possible to speak into in the future, that might be quite a bit more private than this, although permeable in its way. For me, as a sort of a philosopher engaged in building these types of contexts in the project of that, very much kind of an embodied metaphysics. This is how I'm often and always perceiving things. It seems to me to be incredibly real. I don't know how much of that comes through to you, but anyway, it's something I felt like sharing. There are so many things I'd like to ask you about, by the way, and so I'm kind of tossing up when to kind of, disconnect a little bit from the flow of this, there's so much of your time. I really value it, and there's so many things I'd be curious to ask you, and so I'll just say that as well.
Well, I appreciate the way you've kind of laid out there what is sometimes called a threefold vision of society, in that there's this commons, which the cultural commons, where education, but also the arts and science and religion, spirituality, sports, like all these things that we engage in out of our own freedom and desire to know and understand and to express. And then there's the markets, the economy, and the state or government. And I think it's quite natural that we situate ourselves within these three overlapping but somewhat differentiated spheres of activity. And there's this school of thought that comes out of Rudolf Steiner called social threefolding that is quite explicit about these three spheres and how to better organize them for the sake of a healthy society. But it's not like Steiner's proposal is not just made up out of whole cloth by him. It's clear if you look at history, if you look at the present, that there are these three basic domains where human beings have found orientation and importance in the sorts of institutions that crop up in each sphere. And I think it seems to me it would be quite helpful if we became more explicit about the proper role of each of these spheres, because what often happens is you'll have the free market libertarian fundamentalists say, oh, everything should be the market. And the capitalist economy should just get rid of the state. Just think of citizens like customers, and culture should just let it all be commodified, and then everything would be great. And then you have other people who think, who are maybe more on the left communist side of things, that they maybe don't want to frame it this way, but it often in practice is, let's make sure the government is controlling everything to make sure it's all equal and it's all, that the policies and the laws are in place just to make sure that nobody is being treated unfairly, and we'll just legislate everything so it's perfect. And then you have people who get really tied into a particular cultural stream, often a religious form of it, that want to enforce kind of theocracy and have the church, as it were, in control of the economy and in control of laws and whatnot. And so the overemphasis of any of the three spheres becomes damaging to the social organism. And what we need is a better balance between the three, to recognize the unique dignities that each of the three spheres are intended to protect and further. The state, government is primarily about protecting rights and establishing responsibilities that we have to one another. The economy is primarily about providing for human needs in as efficient a way as possible. In the context of consumer capitalism, often the economy is also about inventing new desires, not just fulfilling human needs, but inventing new desires. And I think while we want to, recognize, and the cultural sphere would be about, I think, furthering human freedom, expression, excellence in a variety of different areas, as I was laying out earlier, whether it's education, art, science, spiritual practice. And while we want, each sphere to be recognized as having its unique role and dignity, ultimately, I think it's the cultural sphere that is at the core of who and what we are as human beings. And we want the economy where, corporate firms will make profits if they're doing things efficiently. But we want those profits, whatever doesn't need to be reinvested to keep that firm operating effectively, that profit should be reinvested in culture, in the cultural life. We do have philanthropists, and this does, this proposal for a threefold social order is both a project to be worked at, but it's also just a description of what's already happening, right? It's just that it's not happening as well as it could if we were more intentional about it. And so, I think just hearing you lay that all out definitely resonates with my sense of one way to move forward that acknowledges what the various political and ideological factions at work in the world today are right about, while also pointing out the things that they get wrong when they overplay their hand. And part of what this allows us to do, thinking in this threefold way, is overcome a simple public-private dichotomy, I think, which has its place, but can also hamstring us because, people will talk about the tragedy of the commons, for example. And the thing is, a common area might fall into disrepair because nobody takes ownership over it, because nobody owns it. And I think the kind of social responsibility that we would want to foster would be the opposite of that. Like, we do have a commons, but it's a commons that everybody takes ownership over, that we all care about, and that we belong to. And in the cultural sphere, I like to analogize language and as a form of currency, communication of ideas, sentiments, feelings, emotions. If we think of money as a kind of language, it's a language of the communication of value. And yeah, it's part of the economic sphere, and we need, probably multiple kinds of currency. Right now we have one general purpose currency that doesn't serve us well. I think we should have different kinds of currency for different purposes. But with this general purpose currency, this economy of greed that we have, where it's all about accumulating more and more and more, and we've got an economic model that produces, there aren't many of them, but there are more and more billionaires. And I don't know if people really know the difference between like a million and a billion. It's quite significant. I don't know that there should be billionaires. That's a lot of, so again, the analogy with money and language, it's like a lot of words that are being claimed, a whole, like, multiple chapters of the dictionary are being claimed by these individual private wealth behemoths. Nobody else can use those words. It's like, what's the purpose of money if it's not in circulation? We need to be communicating our values more directly, whether it's with our language or with our monetary instruments and tools, which means if billions of dollars are produced by some corporation because they did something, some service or product really, really well, rather than not just being held or invested to make even more of it, what does the community need? What does the cultural life need? And so we can create more of a circulation of these resources rather than the hoarding mentality that seems to be at the base of our economy right now. So yeah, that's what comes to me in response to the perspectives you were sharing.
Yeah, I hear that. Can I comment on that? I don't mean
Please.
to interrupt. Thank you for laying that out. I'd love to actually share with listeners who might be listening to this for the first time, or maybe you listened to an episode some months ago and you're not aware of some of the other ones. But there's been a number of episodes now in a series on the commons with thinkers like Michelle Bowens, Forrest Landry, O.G. Rose. Did an episode with Nate Haggins as well, slightly separate topic for sort of inquiry there, but technically still part of that series. And then quite recently with O.G. Rose, Michelle Bowens, and Forrest, we had a couple dialogues on the theme of value and civilization, where much of this theoretical perspective is a key part of the conversation, and there's quite a bit of territory explored in a generative way. And actually, Matt, I don't know if you'd be interested in checking it out, but it's an ongoing series and in the context of an inquiry with the Voicecraft Network and what have you. And I feel like you have a lot to add to it. And so it's the kind of thing there as sort of an open invitation if you're interested to join us in that ongoing inquiry. There'll probably be at least a few more, maybe I would say 3 to 5 sort of public podcasts in continuation of some of those themes over the course of the year. So that's kind of just as an aside. And so, yes, it's absolutely very critical. The other thing that came to mind to respond to is the psychological perspective of hoarding. And it speaks in part to the tension, some of the tensions I was trying to presence in the challenge of bringing perspective to bear when that might shine a light on something which sort of destabilizes the house of cards. It does, you know, if we take a train off a cliff or perhaps some other type of vehicle, there's a certain momentum where things more or less stay in the same angle of momentum or whatever. And then eventually it all just catches up, a bit like the Roadrunner. And it is quite remarkable to me how much conversations can repeat, how much repeating of things there is in a way that jams out bringing to presence something with a little bit more vitality to it. The hoarding thing, it's like the capacity that sometimes generates tremendous amount, I mean, the most trivial thing to say ever, the capacity that sometimes generates tremendous asymmetric amounts of wealth isn't always a capacity that knows how or is sufficiently healthy to risk trusting. And there's a remarkable, I want to try and put my, I'm going to try and express this clearly, because it does strike me as important. There's a tremendous mismatch in authority. If people have money in our society, then, well, for the most part, many of the contexts in which they participate are essentially justifying that social hierarchy. They're playing into that hierarchy. They want to participate in the flow of money. But the authority, that real generative authorship, let's say, that authority which can speak more of the relevant patterns of real dynamic interaction actually at play in that particular context to enable the stability of that hierarchy, that authority is less welcome and often reveals a shallowness and a tremendous void of lack in those who might be atop a hierarchy for different reasons. Not always, I'm not trying to make a blanket statements, but there is a game and like new paradigms in which this game runs that influence whether or not this authority or that authority can in fact be checked. If you take the market state and commons, what is it going to take? That's been the question. And that's been like the vision. Like, I could say a lot about this, and there's no rushing it. That's the thing. There's no rushing you can't you can't control or order mutual care for the commons. You can't order mutual participation in philosophy. You can't. You can only be as you are, invite as you can. Sometimes you can make a summons here or there. It won't always be answered. I do think there are interesting ways to stoke and to maybe instigate and confront a little bit. It can be done with a bit of play. But that's the remarkable thing. People are often wanting pitches in the context of this type of thing. They want theories of change as strategies of change and pitches, and here's how it can be done. Here's how are we gonna market this, that type of mentality. And it's just so much, it's so much more subtle, you know. It's so much more subtle, and yet it's also, it's curious, it's both a subtlety, but there's such a tremendous energy there. There's such a tremendous potential that it's well, it seems part of the art is to channel that flow appropriately to the context. And when I speak about private, public, and then that sort of, there's the many membranes between, I definitely don't mean to create sort of any harsh divide or anything like that. But that's why I don't know, I genuinely don't know if it's when it will be possible. It's hard to name the context in which it will be easier for me to speak more clearly in podcasts. I genuinely don't know, because I feel that people can feel it. You can feel when there's real effort at the attempt to appropriately discern where the mutual flow could be in a way that is not, in a way that doesn't shirk the embodied dedication to that whole life context for which and from which, through which one can make dedications at all that can be trusted. It's and yet, you know, here we are, and we haven't spoken so much about, you know, the particular thought world and metaphysics of Whitehead today, but in principle there's an effort to relate with big picture patterns that understandably for people feel like they're so far up there and so far removed. But for me, at the core of this, it's like the praxis of naming one's, like being in touch with, like being somehow true to one's present energetic relation in the context of relating with those big patterns. It's absolutely critical to the health of the possibility for coherence and the coherence that is present. So as we can, in fact, like to enable that deeper kind of discernment of, okay, I feel I understand the orientation of that being in a deep level. I feel I understand whether or not I could invite this person over to have dinner with me, these types of things, and so many others besides. I'm just very skeptical these days of what it is to engage in cultural conversation in the public context. And I do believe we have to be in the context of more and more propaganda, the world of deep fakes on the way. Like, what is it to speak in a manner that signals authentically, with a higher capacity, that there is dedication to speaking with integrity? Not necessarily that there has been nailed the clearest of expressions, and then we have to be cautious about whether or not there's sort of responsibility taken in regards to the context we're speaking into, so as we're not just spouting out absolute rubbish. So that there's all these things to balance, because it's a curious thing, you know, to speak with you, because in another life I could have lived another life. You know, there was another life that in principle could have been open to me, that would have looked like, okay, where could I take a PhD? Where could I study a PhD? Could there be vitality in academia? And this goes back a number of years now. You know, those questions were more alive for me maybe 8 years ago. Anyway, I'll stop there. I could say more things, and I do have some questions for you. So if you would like to respond, please. But otherwise, I can direct us in another way.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting on the impact that this new form of media will have. Artificial intelligence, I feel like, is a misnomer, because in some ways, all intelligence is artificial. Like human
I'd love to
intelligence.
talk more about that. If you could make sure to speak to that with some richness, I would need some to really stay with you in
Sure.
relation there.
To the extent that human beings became tool wielding creatures who have used their big brains and their opposable thumbs to transform the world, that kind of intelligence is much has much to do with the externalization of certain algorithmic processes. Let's say the alphabet, for example, is a technology that is quite artificial, and we have, over not that many generations, I mean, it's been around for a few thousand years, originally developed in port cities where there was a lot of trading and different languages being spoken, and how do you write down what these words sound like in the same set with the same set of letters, so that you can begin to try to translate and communicate and have contracts and everything. And there's also a sacred dimension to the alphabet. So I'm not reducing it just to this economic utility. I think there are other contexts where it becomes a spiritual technology. But the point is, it's this externalization of an endogenous capacity to speak and hear. And it's a synesthetic, it has accomplished this synesthetic synthesis between vision and hearing. And when you become literate, the form of intelligence that becomes available to you is dramatically different from what an oral culture had. Plato writes about this in his dialogue with Phaedrus, the ways that writing amputates our memory. On the one hand, it affords us the ability to have access to way more information than ever before. But on the other hand, to what extent do we become dependent upon notes or the written form in order to speak our mind? Don't get me started on academic conferences and this really staid, tired ritual of reading papers to each other in the most monotone, boring, mind-numbing way that is
I
imaginable.
almost do want to get you started on it, but I won't.
It's like, send me your paper in advance, I'll read it, and then let's talk at the conference. But anyways, so all intelligence is artificial intelligence is an exaggeration, and I intend a particular meaning of intelligence when I say that. So what we're witnessing now with these machine learning technologies is a further amplification of a process that's been going on for thousands of years, massively accelerated. But how that's going to change consciousness, culture, communication, I think is a huge question that I'm really trying to lean into. A lot of my colleagues, as these large language models are coming online, are freaking out about students turning in written assignments that are written by a ChatGPT or what have you. And they're trying to ban it and say, you can never use these things. Others, and I'm more in this camp, want to investigate how these technologies might actually be in service of the learning process and the research process, to facilitate thinking, and certainly to facilitate the kind of testing of ideas. But there's no question it's disrupting education and disrupting politics and disrupting the economy. And the possibilities are both very dark and disturbing, but also I can see some ways in which this might liberate human creativity in some way um, if we can implement these autonomous agents in different ways. It's a kind of, for example, if I could have a robot butler clean my house and cook the odd meal for me and do the dishes, sign me up. If it's affordable, sign me up. Because again, what does that afford me? More leisure time. I do like cooking, and so I wouldn't want it to do all my cooking. But I don't know that I've yet discovered a way to find joy in, cleaning out the bathtub and the toilet. I try. It's a meditative practice, but I'd much rather outsource that. And to the extent that we can free up these menial jobs that nobody wants to do, by employing these technologies, that could unleash human creativity and human connectivity in ways that could be very beneficial. But the marketplace, the capitalist consumer capitalist approach to this, to the development and dissemination of these technologies is what's driving the show right now, and so I'm not going to hold my breath.
Yeah, right. Well, there's so much there in terms of exploring the relationship between humanity, technology, and nature. You mentioned earlier in the dialogue the fragility of present culture by virtue of its technological success and now adaptation to the world that we rely on technology to keep steady, having lost many of the skills that would be necessary to survive at anywhere near this, even a tiny fraction of the complexity that's presently possible for civilization if we lost those technologies, and how many of those activities would also be considered menial tasks, potentially lots. And so it becomes like that conversation to me becomes very difficult to have again if we're not also in a context that's capable of remembering and presencing something that I think is appropriate to reference a lot more like kind of spiritual intelligence or spiritual connection with who we are and what we're doing. And so anyway, in the context of that exploration, again, this is something that will be very present on Voicecraft over the coming months. And there's a number of thinkers, and again, thinking is not the only thing that's necessary here. So there's not an easy shorthand. But yeah, this is also something I'd be very curious for your perspective on in those explorations. Anyway, I can't not say it because in some critical sense, I'm here seeking to build connections in the context of greater participatory understanding. And anyway, and also I understand what you're saying in terms of artificial intelligence and what have you. We can think in terms of psychotechnologies and exaptation and cognition and all these ways of thinking. It's valuable. That might be an interesting pivot because socially there's three separate threads / spheres of connection that I've seen you in conversation with, that I have been in conversation with, have desire to remain in conversation with, and in two of the cases I'm not in conversation with explicitly, but I'm interested in. I can't not be interested in some sense. One of those collaborations you've been involved in is speaking with John Vervaeke and Greg Henriquez, both of whom I know and have spoken to on a number of occasions. Both of whom I think are also in touch with a number of people I consider friends and parts. So I feel in some rich way connected to how they're thinking and what they're interested in. Although I haven't yet listened to your appearance on the Transcendent Naturalism series with John and Greg. I'm very curious about that. My sense is I probably have a lot more in common with the kind of words that I seem called to use in relation to all of that with yourself. And I admit that in the context of, and that Transcendent Naturalism series, what are we talking about? kind of what's at stake there is, even the way I'm going to frame this is partly going to connect with the probably the disagreements and various disputes in the context of what the conversation is, because part of it does seem to me to be there's a kind of academic conversation that can happen in relation to philosophy of mind and metaphysics, where it becomes a little bit more about the language than it does what the language hopes to afford us to realize in perception and connection and creation with each other. Not always. I'm not saying the two can be totally distinguished, or that it's not important to, deeply inquire into the rigidities of, let's say, some historical version of materialism or physicalism. What we're talking about here is ontology and, the fundamental nature of reality. But even that, you've got to take a certain perspective on what's relevant to draw into focus as what constitutes fundamentally what there is. And I used to be super interested in conversations about panpsychism, idealism, physicalism, non-reductive physicalism. This was something that I spent a lot of time with in academic days, and I still am interested. It's much more in the domain of it's slightly closer to a recreation for me, in the sense of like an entertainment. I enjoy it and I think it's valuable. I also don't desire in some sense to make some contribution that finally nails, do you know what I mean, like actually what is. It's like, all right, dude, there's your piece of paper, here's your words, can we communicate with each other, how are we treating with each other, how much are we sharing in coherence. There's all these contextual aspects. Nevertheless, it is important, and for some people it's critically important, and I came through in some respects that pathway of education, and it was very helpful to me in becoming open to various other ways of seeing, right? More fundamental was some psychological things in my life when I was a child. But of course, what's in question here is how can we integrate often the truth, the apparent truth value of spiritual experience, or just the nature of consciousness and meaning as such as it appears, in a philosophical depiction of what actually is. What can we justify as being really real or something like this? That would seem to be important. People have found that pretty interesting. So I'm kind of curious, for your reflections on, your conversation with John and Greg. I know I've said I haven't listened to it, so why would I be asking for it? I have a sense of how they think and see, right? And maybe not all our listeners will, so that's why I've kind of left this to the end. I just want to name that as an interest. I also want to name a big interest in, I know you've spoken to Michael Levin. I'm very interested in speaking to him. I think his work is a kind of scientific, credible example of pointing to a lot of what's been there for exploration for some time. And I know that, we'd have a tremendous amount of perspective to share on this, and have spent a lot of time in contemplation. I know also you've had conversations with Merlin Sheldrake, of course, the whole Whitehead and mushrooms thing. I think there's a very clear connections to make in terms of the way that Whitehead can be helpful for thinking through ecology in the context of mycelial stuff and all of that. That's been present in my world of thinking and relating with friends for some time, so it's nice to see that out there. One of those conversations where I'm like, yeah, I want to plug into that. Hey, this is a really nice base of shared conception to see with and see from. And I name these three in part because again, this is slightly more towards the personal side than it is kind of what's relevant for people publicly. And so I I ask for forgiveness for listeners from that. In and amongst all of that, I do in fact think that, philosophical thinking inspired at least, but not only, by Whitehead, many others as well, truly many others. But I do think the process-relational, you can even chuck in theological if you like. This is something I am less well versed in from a literary and wide reading perspective, so I tend to stay away from referencing theology, although, certainly it's animated there in what influences me. But something in there, there's so much richness and mystery. The manner in which our participatory, let's just say our experiential access, the possibilities for discernment, and I want to say knowing, in the context of fields of, we could say, whether you want to say pattern intelligence, right? The possibility for some dialogic interaction, relationship. People variously want to ontologize these things differently, and it's important, and I care about the rigor of this conversation. But it really does seem to me, I'm very curious for the coming decades to continue to learn more about the manner in which, in some sense, like the deep history, as well as like essence, in a sense, a kind of essence of coherence and the possibility for access and participating in that can be more fully, if not entirely, I don't think entirely, understood in terms of the patterns of intelligibility we see play out at different levels of reality. I've said so much there. I'm picking on all these things, and I would have to say more to give some richness to all of where I'm coming from. But all those domains are areas I'm very interested to talk to you about, and I'm curious about your reflections in maybe conversations you've shared there. What have you felt drawn to speak in those contexts? How do you feel? Like, what do you feel yourself to be bringing to them? I think that's probably close to what would, at least for me, lend me the most like possibility of connecting into your world of kind of contribution in the time we have left. And I don't know how helpful that is for listeners, so I apologize about that, but I am curious.
Well, as a philosopher, I think I am always eager to talk to scientists of various sorts. Philosophy is itself kind of empty of content on some level, and it's more of a way of engaging with everything else. And not to say that metaphysics is empty of content, but when you're talking about the primordial categories in terms of which we make sense of the world, when you just come out and state those outside the context of some application to the special sciences, to human experience, to art, religion, whatever it may be, those categories, they're so abstract, they don't mean anything to anybody. And so when I'm in my wheelhouse and talking to other philosophers who have, like maybe process philosophers who have studied Whitehead, they know his categorical scheme, and we can geek out about that. It's, you said recreational. Yeah, it's really enjoyable because we share that language and we can navigate that the spaces of abstraction in a way that is enriching and for us, enriching. But how does it translate to anything else? And so I'm always seeking out these dialogues with, like John Vervaeke, he's a cognitive scientist, and Greg Henriquez is a psychologist. Michael Levin, developmental biologist. Merlin Sheldrake, mycologist, and the sorts of conversations that can happen across that disciplinary bridge, to build those disciplinary bridges, for me is what it's all about. I take transdisciplinarity very seriously. I think if anything is,
it's thinking. How can we not transition? It's the most outrageous thing ever. It's the most outrageous thing ever that's a point that it feels like it needs to be made. Like it's super shocking. It's actually shocking, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, if anything could save universities, it's renewal of this transdisciplinary spirit out of which they were born in the first place. There's always the risk of becoming undisciplined, but we're so stuck in these disciplinary ruts that to some degree we do need to undiscipline ourselves as academics. And so, these are, I had a conversation with Merlin and another biologist, Timothy Jackson, who's a toxinologist, evolutionary toxinologist, studies reptiles and venoms. And that conversation was about improvisation. And I think the role of play in transdisciplinary research is essential. It is playful in the sense that we don't know what sorts of connections are going to arise. We don't have a set agenda, as is often the case in a disciplinary context, where you have a paradigm, you have a set of instruments, and you're just trying to inch the ball forward a little bit along the same trajectory that people in that discipline have been pushing it forward for however long. Transdisciplinary dialogue and research is playful in the sense that we're making up the rules of the game as we go, and I just live for that. And so in the context of this dialogue with Vervaeke and Henriquez, I respect both of them. I was honored to be invited to join them in dialogue about transcendent naturalism. But one of the first things I said in that conversation was that I'm not so sure I could not feel somewhat suffocated by the term naturalism. Not that I'm a supernaturalist, but historically that term comes with certain limits around what is considered legitimate that I don't agree with. Similarly, the term transcendent. I like to be, more relational, and immanence is an important correction to the vector of this up and out kind of spirituality that has characterized not just the West, but many Eastern traditions as well, where transcendence becomes escapist. And so both of those terms are problematic for me, but it's not because I want to affirm the opposite. It's more about just being careful with labels. Like, I understand in their communities of discourse why they would have chosen that particular phrase. And it's not so much just about the words, because when we got into the conversation, as they define what it means to them, what kind of non-reductive naturalism they're talking about, it's like, I'm on board with all of that. And so there's some degree of careful attention to how we package terms and how different communities are going to hear those terms, what associations they're going to have. That's always an issue. But in any more technical form of discourse, you're going to have to triangulate and define what you mean. And you can hopefully very quickly get below that layer of just how is this packaged, and arrive at a shared language. But Greg Henriquez has his universal theory of knowledge, I think is what it's called, UTOC. And I haven't gone
Unified,
into the weeds.
I believe.
Unified, thank you. Mm-hmm. I haven't gone into the weeds or even very deeply at all. I've listened to a few of his videos where he discusses it, and I don't shy away from being systematic, but and obviously, I'm a Whiteheadian, and so his metaphysics is quite elaborate and systematic, but it's also flexible and revisable, and there's a certain degree of vagueness. Vagueness is actually a technical term in Whitehead's philosophy that allows you room to be poetic at the same time that you're being analytically precise. And I worry sometimes about, and I don't want to accuse Greg of this, but many people in academia who break out of the disciplinary mold want to create the theory of everything. And if that is done in a collaborative way, where many people are included, and you're doing that sort of transdisciplinary play, the urge to systematize actually gets inhibited by the desire to keep the game open-ended and surprising. And so it's like what ends up happening usually is that very intelligent individuals will build up their huge systems, and maybe then they have people who want to follow and learn from them and start to speak that language too. But then it becomes this walled structure. And maybe the view from the top of that castle that you've built is beautiful, and it's could be possibly worth the effort to learn that language, but how inviting is it to everybody else? And can it really be a system of everything if the vast majority of people either don't have the time to learn it or the ability to understand it or don't care? And so, while I'm not immune to the desire for, systematic precision and clarity and elaborate thought structures, I always try to remain attentive to the extent to which some may be alienated by it, and I want to be as inclusive as I can with my language, and I don't want to get attached to certain words, like panpsychism, for example. I enjoy the sort of spirit of playful debate about like panpsychism versus idealism versus physicalism. That can be fun, and I think it is valuable in the ways that it can feed into the question of worldviews and how different worldviews motivate different belief structures and actions, and the way we think the world is definitely affects the way we treat each other and the world, and so I don't think it's totally a useless exercise. Not saying you were saying it was, but I understand why you didn't just stay in that domain of debating the isms. In terms of Michael Levin, I'm pretty sure I would be surprised if 10, 20 years from now he's not going to win a Nobel Prize for the work that he's doing.
100%.
Yeah. And so I'm definitely keeping close tabs on everything coming out of his lab, and hope to collaborate with him on some of the philosophical implications of his work, because it has medical applications, obviously, but it also changes the way we think about bioethics and the way that we imagine evolution, our own evolutionary history. And, there's no question that the ways that Darwin's understanding of evolution as a process of individual competition primarily, and he wasn't even as hardcore about that as, more of the 20th century neo-Darwinians were, but our view of biological evolution has influenced our view of how the human economy should function. And there are ways in which people try to naturalize capitalism as just, well, that's how evolution works. Struggle for existence, and the fittest survives. But there's so many things left out of that picture that I think Levin's not the first to point out, but he's doing it in a experimental way. There's so many more theoretical biologists who integrate and synthesize the data in a way that's compelling, that would challenge the sort of reductionistic, struggle. Everything is a competitive struggle among individuals. But he's pointing out the ways in which cellular intelligence is this collective intelligence, and that the trillions of cells involved in our metabolic activity, involved in my ability to form words, that there's this orchestration that going on that boggles the mind, and nobody's in charge of any of it. It emerges. And it's constantly surfing that boundary between chaos and order. And to reimagine the living world in these terms as this collaborative project where the boundary between one individual and another is a constant ongoing negotiation. And you might think you're this individual one moment, but the next moment, as a result of a fusion of horizons with other formerly independent individuals, now you're at some new identity together, right? um, and so he's experimentally, empirically showing uh, how ideas, which as a philosopher I just have to argue for from a theoretical point of view, um, he's making it real. And so I'm really excited to see the direction his work goes, and he's very careful, and at the same time about the claims that he makes, and at the same time he's so open to talk to anyone in a sort of free, speculative way. But he's just very careful not to make scientific claims when he's doing all that imaginative exploration of ideas with people. And I know he's friends with the Sheldrakes, and is very curious about things like morphic resonance and these more metaphysical theories about how habit forms in the biological world. And so he's open to that, but also, again, like very careful to differentiate between what he's claiming and what these bigger metaphysical pictures might be putting on the table. And I just love it. And I look forward to speaking with him more. And Merlin is quite explicitly Whiteheadian himself. And so, not just a mycologist, but a brilliant thinker, philosopher in his own right. And so getting the chance to know him and his work, not just as a scientist, he's doing interesting research as a scientist, but also popularizing that work. I'm really eager to see this new IMAX film that he did with Bjork, building on his book on fungi. And that has a real impact on cultural life and gives people a new perspective and perspective on and appreciation for the wonders of the natural world that I think can help reorient us away from the other distractions and anxieties and ways that we forget the miracle of the fact that anything exists at all. I think if we could all find ways of returning to this primal wonder that every human being comes into the world with, a lot of the other seemingly really complicated problems that we're facing might just resolve themselves, right? Because we stop participating in reifying them and creating them, because we've shifted our values and our modes of attention to discover just the simple wonder of existence. So, yeah, did I cover all the bases?
Yeah, I think you did a great job, actually. No, thank you, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm picking up lots there. I know our time's coming to an end. I would really enjoy a speculative. I mean, I have speculative conversations about this stuff all the time, and it certainly makes up a lot of what's on the pulse of my own individual, let's say, seeking with respect to, philosophy, these aspects, of it. There's, you mentioned the connection between philosophy and having access, merely to theory, and that distinguishing between, the experimental practice of science and what have you. And I get what you mean, but it seems to me that I I tend to, maybe just to situate a bit of myself. I mean, for sure, two of the writers that have been most influential, at least among the dead, are for me Whitehead and Jung, both in playful ways. Hey, I'm not the kind to take the authority to scholarly speak from the perspective of a Jungian about every question or a Whiteheadian about every question, but I feel as though I've been genuinely swimming with the deep currents of the thinking and the perception associated with these ways and others and Bergson. And it's always felt to me that my access to understanding, I mean, to the degree there's truth that is pointed at in the theory, the speculations, we participate in that truth. It's not the case that, and it's partly like, there's this system over here or that over there that's nailed some metaphysical relationships, and we've got these concepts that are, absolutely refined tools now, and they so easy to mistake the finger for the moon in such instances. It seems to me that the access to knowing closer to truth in that sense that wants to reify, but that which wants to know truth is participating in some critical sense as truth, as here we are, most basic point in the world, here we are living out creativity in part. We've mentioned about the order and all the structure and the patterns and the relation between, but we live it out. We realize what is. We know it through is. And that's not to say we encapsulate the entirety of it in what we bring to expression, or that we can stand outside of it in some view from nowhere and up there it is, there's the truth, and that we're of course always involved as part of that emergent process, unfolding process, evolving process. All of those words for me I prefer to poetically blur, because I don't ultimately trust any particular theory or set of language that wants to rest too strongly in really the meaning of emergence. I know that's a bit of a silly thing to say in some sense. We can say a lot of things about emergence, but certainly emergence is often the kind of thing that can be spoken about in a radical sense, like classically mind from matter being kind of, for me, a fairly egregious one, that it's possible for such radical discontinuity to emerge in a way that sort of befuddles the possibility for how two things can relate at all. And so in some sense that seems, when we're talking about discrete universes, but now we're naming discrete universes, so actually there's a breakdown here in the ways in which we can use a lot of this language. But for me, there's a the context of where Michael Levin's work points to, and you've got the morphic resonance side. You're mentioning those connections there. I think Rupert Sheldrake, he has, for so many people, I think he's opened some doors of perception, and plenty of what he says, at least in his original book, the hypothesis of formative causation or something, I forget exactly what it's called, the morphic resonance book. I feel like there's lots in there which is like, he is freely speculating and attempting to bring some rigor to it, and there's a lot of that which I don't feel is, maybe he wouldn't even necessarily endorse it all today, but the opening of the doorway of perceiving that, thinking that way, in that in some sense that there seems to be this, it's so difficult to name, because within so many paradigms of our thinking and expression, we come up against kind of paradoxes in attempting to name it. Because if we are speaking about, in some sense, if we're talking, or Viveki's language, transjectivity, if we're speaking about that which is the relation between the external and the internal, and here we are in relationship together in some critical sense. If there is understanding here, it's for both of us to participate in, and I feel confused to the degree I step away from what is at least in an integrity of effort with attempting to communicate with you here. Like I can go in, I could lose myself totally in some little internal world, to the degree I kind of just disconnected from that relationship here. And so we seem to be participating in an organismic process. Again, Whitehead, we participate in an organismic process that in the immanence of our expression, we are, in that sense, representative of, but affirming and living out, we could say, a kind of concrescence. Here we are, the actual occasion of a concrescence, of coming together, of being in relation. We know the influence then, if we want to talk about, on societies, right? And we are informed by all this history. There's domains of potentiality. And all of that speaks to a greater than, which could be encapsulated right now, because here we are, just a moment, a duration, but a living one in process, right? And it's because of that processual element that we can say, actually, here we are kind of living out a kind of truth in some sense. And it's like and it's in that there's like there's a spark of that. There's a charge of that which resonates in principle for me, like up and down the whole stack. Like it animates the whole. It's in continuity with all that is, and in that knowing, in that participation, in that improvisation of expression, in the very effort of it, in some sense, it's not just theoretical. Right, it is a practice. And what happens if, when groups of people get together, we could plug in the whole world of synchronicity, of exploring what that means, right? Memory over landscapes, over eons. There's a tremendous amount that you can take in terms of the biology, Michael Levin looking at biologies and all these cells, all that stuff. Incredibly fascinating. And then one wonders, these membranes between our participating intelligences, just what in fact are we in touch with? Like, what is it to speak? Hey, what is it to conduit expression? What is it to participate in that broader sense in creativity? And there is like this unbelievably interesting, both scientific inquiry, but also in some sense a kind of like an eternal seat of mystery that isn't to encapsulate and can only ever be offered in kind of like in homage, in honor, yeah, with grace to the degree it's possible to do so, to that mystery. And it's an invitation for the next one. It's an invitation for the next one, to name it next, to express it next. It doesn't get it. It's not finally enclosed. And so yes, all of that, for me is so deeply relevant to how we began this conversation, and just in the seeking of what it is to connect and relate in the context of the big picture, but also very much in the animation of the energy that we're living out here and now. Thank you for listening anyway.
Well, yeah, I mean, I resonate with so much of what you're saying. I mean, truth as an event that we participate in, it's not out there waiting for us to find it. We bring it about. And it struck me as you were speaking that the brain is very much a social organ in multiple senses. It's a community of billions of neurons, obviously, that through this thing we call emergence gives rise to our consciousness. Though I think the parts that out of which the whole of consciousness emerge are more than just the neurons in the brain, because the brain is social in another sense, that it's through the interface and the social coordination between human beings that we become conscious as well, and self-conscious, right? And so consciousness is so much more than something easily or simply located inside the skull. It's like truth. It's a process that we are engaged in. We are as much inside of it as it is inside of us, if that sort of spatial metaphor even makes sense. And yeah, with in regards to just mind and matter, and the claim that mind might emerge to matter, I mean, I have to quickly just say on that point, and then I've got to run here, that to say that mind or consciousness could emerge from matter, and when we say that we have some understanding of matter already, and that mind somehow comes out of that, If that were possible, then we don't actually have an understanding of what matter is, because our understanding of what matter is does not include mind. And so it's like a self-contradictory idea that mind could emerge from matter. It means we didn't understand what matter was in the first place, if that's possible, right? And so when we start to ask, well, then what is matter? I think we're led in a very different direction than some kind of brute emergence like that. So anyways, that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, this was brilliant. And I'm glad to have some serious time to connect with you, your mind and heart. It was quite enjoyable and enriching. And so I hope we can do it again sometime soon. And I will take a look at those conversations on the Commons and see.
I'll send you a few links.
Great. See if I might have anything to contribute there.
Oh, you definitely do. Awesome. Well, thank you, Matt. I really appreciate it. Have a lovely evening.
Thanks, Tim. Enjoy your Saturday.
Bye-bye.